the Scottish Rite takes an interest in this because at the time in the early 1900s, they kind of umbrellaed all mental illnesses under this huge concept of dementia praecox,
Okay.
meaning early onset dementia. Meaning, if grandpa gets dementia, it's like, okay, well, he's old, right?
Hmm.
Like old people, they go crazy after a while, they get dementia. We don't know what to do about it. It's just a fact of life.
Hmm.
However, if your 20-year-old kid develops dementia and they start acting schizophrenic, now it becomes a concern because they don't necessarily know exactly what causes it. And more importantly, they want to figure out how to eradicate it. You want to make sure that the person you're passing your entire lineage to isn't a schizophrenic before they're even old enough to start establishing themselves in the world and carry on your legacy. So very much in an elitist point of view, it's a self-serving, like, how do I fix this? I need to pass the legacy on to the kid. The kid's
Right.
going crazy.
Right.
This is essentially when the Scottish Rite says, well, let's investigate the human brain. Let's figure out what exactly is happening to cause schizophrenia in certain people. And they put together a huge fund, the Scottish Rite Northern Jurisdiction
Hmm.
in particular. They put together this huge fund and they just start bankrolling anyone that looks into any kind of schizophrenic research. And a lot of that ends up dovetailing directly into adrenochrome specific research because of the findings
From
of
the
Osmond,
findings.
Smithies, and Hoffer.
Are there any examples of success stories of extracting schizophrenia?
Not necessarily that they were onto something that was defined by Carl Jung, mentioned something called toxin X, and
Okay.
he theorized that there was some sort of a chemical that the body itself would produce, and once it starts producing this, it would be the cause of schizophrenia,
Hmm.
and that if you could stop the brain from producing it, or again, if you could filter it out from the bloodstream, then you could solve schizophrenia, as if it were like a hat you could put on and take back off. And this is, I believe, the basis for a lot of even the modern day claims of the elites go and they drink adrenochrome or adrenalized blood and they trip out and maybe they live and the wrinkles kind of just melt away on the spot. A lot of that is this same thinking of, oh, if we can just put a chemical into my body or filter a chemical out of my body, then you'll have these instant changes. What they found is that it's not necessarily as straightforward as that.
Yep.
And more likely, the high levels of adrenochrome in someone's blood was more of an indicator. It was an indicator that they were going through a schizophrenic episode, much less that the adrenochrome itself was causing that schizophrenia. And there are lots of studies that get really interesting and controversial as you look into all of this. That continues all the way into the mid 90s.
I want to hear some of those if you can, but real quick, I just want to say, like, this idea of the fountain of youth is something that's in human nature. Like, there's so many stories about this idea of finding something, right, that can replenish your age, make you younger. And just when you were saying that, it made me think of the story of Elizabeth Bathory. You know about her? Isn't she the one that
Right, the lady
in...
that would bathe in the blood of her servants
Right.
for rejuvenating purposes, right? And again, I would say that all of those versions of blood magic, and you could usually tie a lot of that into kind of blood libel uh, charges as well, because it usually has to do with children,
Yeah.
usually like virgin children or
Innocent
Christian
children.
children, and then
Yep.
that their blood is somehow more magical than anyone else's blood, and then therefore this rejuvenating properties. I think that adrenochrome doesn't create those. It just became the new medium for what might otherwise feel like outdated claims. Well,
Right.
now there's this new chemical version of it that everything old is new again because we've got like a new medium for it.
Right. So you were saying about these experiments that were up to the 90s, I believe. Can you
Yeah,
share some of
well,
those?
we'll skip right to, I guess, the most interesting part of this is that Dr. Abram Hoffer, after literally like 60 years of his life, is dedicated towards looking into this adrenochrome since he had found it.
Hmm.
His first studies were in the 1950s, and then he releases a paper in 1994. So at the very least, 4 decades of research, and it's called The Benefits of Adrenochrome, and it's piggybacking on top of a paper that he continuously developed and republished called the schizophrenia hypothesis, or the adrenochrome hypothesis of schizophrenia, which again was based on that premise that somehow adrenochrome was causing schizophrenia. Well, in his 1994 paper, he makes some very specific claims, and the claims are more about having schizophrenia in your family line more so than adrenochrome as a substance. He gets into that, and I'll mention some of the interesting points. But if you were to conflate schizophrenia and adrenochrome, because that's what the basis for this funding and research was, he makes a claim that this might sound outlandish, but he says that during the bubonic plague, the Black Plague, that a large number of people that survived that were more likely than not to have schizophrenia in their family line, and that if you were to oversimplify all of humanity into two buckets, and you said you're either a cancer person or you're a dementia person, like clearly people can have both, they can have neither, but if you were to create those two camps, he claims that there's not necessarily an advantage in having schizophrenia yourself, but if your parents had it or if your grandparents had it, meaning it's like somehow a recessive gene, if you were to look at it that way, that there's benefits because the first order of relatives of these patients, parents, children, siblings of schizophrenics, they do have markable advantages compared to those that don't. For example, and he lists these: more youthful appearance, less gray hair as you age, more ability to tolerate pain, more resistance to bacterial infections, and they even go into doing studies of lung cancer and other forms of malignant cancer, and they make the claim that, for example, those that have schizophrenia in their family line have less bouts with lung cancer, and the ones that do have bouts with any kind of cancer, they tend to actually be able to be resolved and they can go into remission. Whereas people that do not have schizophrenia in their family line, they more typically have chronic forms of cancer, like cancer that keeps coming back and does not go away. And that this, along with intellectual, he also equates people that have schizophrenia in their family line tend to be artistic musicians, like kind of original thinkers. He's kind of really selling on having schizophrenics in your family line.
Great.
And then he goes on to mention how this relates to adrenochrome. And one of those is a study where he found what you would call an LSD hardhead. It's someone that they could just straight up inject with massive amounts of LSD, and the person just did not have the subjective experience that most people report from taking LSD. However, the moment they introduced adrenochrome in addition to this LSD, now the person is having the exact same subjective experience that you would expect. Whoa. So he starts tying these dots of, well, maybe it's not adrenochrome, but more than that, maybe it's not even LSD that's making someone have these experiences. It's a combination of the two, that if you didn't have adrenochrome in your blood, then psychedelics might not even affect you at all. And this is where you can almost rewind and see maybe the military would have a use for this, knowing that this substance almost acts as an on-off binary switch for whether or not you're going to have a psychedelic experience on any platform.
Wow. So I just want to rehash what you're saying really quick. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying schizophrenia is good for you, and we should all hopefully have it because it'll keep us looking young. And
you want grandma and grandpa to have it. You don't want to have it. Maybe your parents, if you're comfortable with it being that close to you. But that you want it to be in your family line, but not in you personally.
Okay.
And even in that case, it's more. It's not like you want it. It's just that statistically and based on his research, you would be more resistant to cancer and more resistant to things like the bubonic plague and bacterial infection, and even showing signs of old age by simply having schizophrenia in your family. And now, if you tie in that the only reason that any of these scientists cared about adrenochrome was because of its relation to schizophrenia, now you can start to see where those dots connect, where, okay, well, if having schizophrenia in my family line is somehow better for me in the long run or my progeny, well, then maybe if there were a way to just inject adrenochrome into me directly and that would cause schizophrenia. One of the analogies that I make, not Dr. Abram Hoffer, but it almost sounds like going to the gym for being crazy. So the closer you can bring yourself to the brink of being schizophrenic and not falling in and then easing yourself back and going back into normalcy, if you can continuously do this, just like you'd go to the gym and lift weights and break those muscle fibers just to get stronger the next time, if you can continuously put yourself into these schizophrenia inducing moments and not fall all the way over, you're kind of building up a resistance, not just to being an actual schizophrenic, but you might actually be fighting off cancer and bacterial infection. Again, it might sound outlandish, but this is the culmination of this guy's over 4 decades of research. And again, this was not a fringe random scientist that only looked into adrenochrome. He is literally the person responsible for putting niacin and iron in your Cheerios.
So that's the story of my life, just balancing on the edge of schizophrenia. I have it in my family, and when I was, there's they say there's an age where you might, it might start showing signs. I was always like, oh, am I gonna make it or not? Because I have some pretty wild cousins who have been in prison their whole life for schizophrenic outbursts. But while you're talking about that breaking the mind thing, it made me think of, and we're talking about like government experiments, MKUltra, kind of makes me think of like some of the experiments that went wrong allegedly with someone like Jolly West, right? And he would it seemed like he would break people's minds while performing MKUltra experiments. There's that guy in the book Chaos by Tom O'Neill who might have murdered, or he did murder a little kid while on some perhaps MKUltra bender. The guy who jumped out of the window,
And Dr. Frank Olson.
Thank you, Dr. Frank Olson, and then there's the other person I'm thinking of. I'm spacing on right now. That Jolly West visited, the guy who shot Jack Ruby.
Jack Ruby.
Oh,
and there's even some
Jack
claims
Ruby.
of Timothy McVeigh, but yeah.
Yes. So maybe there's something there too of like, all of this stuff is like always a war on how we view reality and on our brains. So it seems like all of this is the ingredients of our government's favorite stuff when it's playing with our minds.
The scariest part for me of all of Dr. Jolly West's research is that he sort of concluded that the most effective form of mind control and to break someone and to instill, the multiple personalities, all of that is just simple sleep deprivation. And it doesn't even require more than about 3 days worth.
Yep.
So all of the exotic chemicals and psychedelics and torture techniques pale in comparison to just not letting someone get a good night's sleep for about 3 days.
Yep.
Once you get them past those initial 72 hours of not having good sleep, you can basically influence them as much as you could on any drug known to man.
So
Right.
mothers.
So yeah, so mothers,
Right.
Alex.
That explains everything.
Is that why my wife is like that? That's fascinating. We have a 7-month-old and haven't been sleeping much.
But and I have another. This is I don't hear this one brought up at all in adrenochrome, and I don't even know if there even is adrenochrome research. It almost just sounds like people repeat crazy conspiracy theories they read online, and they count that.
We're
as
doing
research,
it right now.
but
Yeah,
we are doing that right now. One of those aspects of research, though, is that they concluded fairly early on in these 1930s, 1940s research that adrenochrome might not be the cause. It's somehow related to schizophrenia, but it's not the cause, because even if you get into low levels or if you take it out and you put it in someone else's body, it doesn't have the effects they expected it to. So plan B was literally just eugenics. Plan B was, well, if we can't solve it chemically, then the only way to deal with this dementia praecox from your 20-year-old progeny not being able to carry on the legacy is to simply weed them out. Just make sure that they don't procreate with anybody else.
Yeah.
And you'll see the Huxley family, again, Aldous Huxley is the one that introduces this to the rest of the world through Osmond. And the Huxleys, even to this day, if you look at the Huxley Foundation's kind of repurposed a little bit, but it's straight up eugenics.
Straight up.
And this is based on maybe a self-preservation thing. It's like, I want to make sure that you don't have kids because I see that you're crazy, and I don't want my great-great-grandkids to, even by chance, mate with your great-great-grandkids, knowing that they might become schizophrenic, and now they won't be able to pass on my legacy generations removed.
Right.
So the only solution for that is to remove you from the gene pool.
Right.
And now you've got the Rockefeller Foundation, the Macy Foundation, and I guess to add a little bit of fire to this is that as soon as the Scottish Rite funding, I wouldn't say dries up, but once that stops, the baton gets passed directly to the CIA and to these Rockefeller foundations. So now it goes from publicly funded, the results being, published publicly, to now it's all secretive.
Just south of where I lived most of my life when I was in New York was Cold Spring Harbor, where they had a whole eugenicist facility. I think from the 30s is when it started, maybe earlier. But when you were saying initially about the Scottish Rite stuff, that foundation, I was thinking like it's like schizophrenic eugenics, because they want to. But I guess they didn't care to have their descendants have a little bit of schizophrenia to ward off cancer. If only they knew.
No, well, that was the hypothesis put forth by Dr. Abram Hoffer in '94.
If only they knew.
And there are very little people that agree with anything that he put out about adrenochrome. But and this is what's kind of crazy to me. This is that lady doth protest too much dynamic that made me continuously interested in this. Is that even in his reports, while he was being funded by the Scottish Rite publicly, and he's actually documenting this and publishing his findings, he makes a note that he finds it odd. He keeps finding resistance among all his peers. That once he brings up this concept of adrenochrome, all of his peers, they immediately try and discount it. They immediately try and disprove everything he's doing. And he makes a very specific note that those that are the biggest naysayers, they tend to not have any of the research themselves. They don't go out and try and synthesize adrenochrome. They just read what he was putting out and say, nuh-uh, that doesn't make sense. That's not true. And that the people that do actually extract adrenochrome from adrenaline and test it on animals and test it on even themselves and their wives and their colleagues, that they all report a unequivocal, objective experience, like an actual psychedelic experience, mind-changing, versus the rest of the establishment that just says, no, that's impossible. And that continues even now today. Even when he published that in 1994, it was just like, oh, come on, please. We can look back 30 years and find people that were saying that your research amounted to nothing and that it was basically all made up or just incorrectly done.
Do you think they're doing stuff today with adrenochrome?
From everything that I've read so far, it seems that we've just got way too many better alternatives. Like if you wanted a psychedelic experience of some kind, there's easier ways that'll get you directly from point A to point B than going through adrenochrome. And again, a lot of these studies tended to show that adrenochrome was more of a catalyst or almost like a precursor to a psychedelic experience, not in and of itself. And and one of those in particular is Dr. Abram Hoffer does bring a bunch of adrenochrome home to his wife and to his friends, and they all try it out on each other. They take it sublingually, they put it under their tongue, and within minutes, they all start writing down on this little like checklist of, okay, am I hearing voices? Am I seeing things? Do I feel inebriated? And they go through and they basically realize across the board, it has the exact same effects as mescaline, just far less pronounced. It's just a lot weaker version of maybe what you do on mescaline. And there's another substance that after adrenochrome itself continues to break down in the body, it creates something called angiolutin. And angiolutin, they mention, was even less useful to research for the opposite reason, that one of the testers would try it and they would basically have a psychedelic experience that could last up to 2 weeks. And that the length and the intensity of this experience made it less valuable of a research tool, because if you want to do some research and you're like, okay, I'll see you in 2 weeks from now when I'm back to normal, it's not as conducive to doing your job. So, and this one has been described as a goldish greenish liquid. So I just have to throw it out there because there was a small moment in time when the same adrenochrome conspiracy claims were being tossed around. There was also one, this chick from Orange is the New Black, and she mentioned that she's at this Hollywood party, and they asked her, did you drink the gold juice or the green gold juice? Yeah. And that was exactly where my mind went. It was like, there actually is precedent for this adrenochrome adjacent angiolutin that does have these properties of you would trip for 2 weeks if you even took it.
Dude, I think they're totally doing this still. Like, I don't know about the experiment stuff, but I feel like they're out there doing this. Just because we know they do so much. Like when I say they, the elites, who knows, these like crazy, insane people with lots of money, they go to great lengths to do the most depraved stuff. It's like, why wouldn't they do something
another
like this?
analogy that I bring up sometimes, and when this comes up, is there is a certain meal that I think it's an orphan bunting, where they sort of feed this little orphan bunting, a small little bird. This is like a band practice. This is like a black mark. You got to get invited to a restaurant after they close in Paris at like 3 a.m. But they basically drown a little bird in cognac. I'm gonna make some of this up. They drown like a bird in cognac and they like flash fire it, and they serve it to you. And the way that you're supposed to eat it is you put a napkin over your head to hide your shame from God, because of this like horrible cruelty that this animal goes through. And then they take the entire orphan bunting, the entire bird, beak, feathers, feet, bones, everything, in whole, put it in their mouth, and just crunch down and chew the bones and swallow it whole.
Whoa.
And the reason that I usually bring this up as an analogy is like, it might not even taste good, right? But someone out there is like, have you had ornament bunting? Oh, it's like $50,000 a dish. You might get arrested if you try it.
Yeah.
There's someone that's like, oh, now I really need to do that.
Yes.
And in that same case, someone could tell you, man, there's this great LSD or this great synthetic, and you can trip for this amount of time, and it's so easy. And they're like, well, what's the most, the most outlandish form of this? Oh, well, there is this adrenochrome stuff, and of course, someone out there would be like, I'm willing to try that just for the experience, just to say that I did it one time. So it's impossible to discount that aspect, that someone would go to the lengths.
Yeah. But
I don't necessarily know if all of the properties ascribed to it are factual.
right. Yeah. I mean, who knows? You know, the schizophrenic part of my brain is just like they've synthesized it and they're putting in us, and they're sprinkling it from the sky, and everyone in the military is getting it injected into them. That seems about right.
Another part of this is that so much of the research says that it's never been a psychedelic. That's the fringe part. If you ask an AI or a Grok or any LLM, or you just do a modicum of research from typical sources, it will say that part is completely made up, that it's not schizophrenic. However, there is a video, a declassified MKUltra video from, I think, 1955 that specifically states that adrenochrome is a psychedelic. And if you were to, you can go and find this on archive.org now, but the video title is called Experimental Compound MER17. And MER17 is actually a substance called Frenquil. And during MKUltra, MER17, they were looking at this as an antidote for all psychedelics, so that if you were unwittingly dosed by, enemy forces, and you realize, oh my God, they gave me LSD or mescaline or whatever, you could take some of this MER17 to counteract the effects, and then you could sober up again. Or more likely, you'd keep acting like you were under the influence, but you'd actually be sober, so you can kind of like turn it around on them. In this video presentation that is being given to these like CIA field agents, they specifically cite MER17 as combating the effects of adrenochrome. So clearly there is documented record of the CIA considering adrenochrome not only to be psychedelic, but that they have found an antidote for how psychedelic adrenochrome was. It's just one extra bit of evidence where clearly the government did consider it psychedelic, and even so much as they were trying to find antidotes for it. Yet now in 2025, most research will say that's not true, that no one has ever considered it a psychedelic outside of fringe.
So interesting.